was a grey and dreary morning in London, the kind that presses upon one's spirits with a damp insistence and a certain chill that no fire in Baker Street could wholly dispel. I had been roused early by the persistent rattle of a hansom cab outside our flat, its driver impatiently ringing the bell as if the world itself could not proceed until he had made his demand. I was still adjusting the folds of my dressing gown when Sherlock Holmes, ever imperturbable, appeared at the doorway, a hint of his customary sardonic amusement lurking beneath the shadow of his sharp, hawk-like features. "Watson," he began, his voice slicing through the morning fog of my lethargy, "it appears that London is set to provide us with a most curious diversion. There is a visitor awaiting us in the sitting-room. I can discern the desperation in his footsteps, and the scent of agitation is almost palpable anecdotal evidence, you see, that he comes to us out of necessity rather than mere curiosity." I followed his glance toward the door, where, as if on cue, it opened to reveal a man whose appearance was, in itself, a study of anxiety and unease. He was tall, gaunt even, with eyes that darted about the room like those of a hunted animal. His attire, once elegant, bore the rumpled marks of a hurried departure, and his hands trembled as he clutched a folded letter to his chest, as though it were a talisman against the dread that he could not yet articulate. "Good morning, gentlemen," he began, his voice faltering under the weight of some unspoken horror. "IA was advised to come here. They said Mr. Holmes could assist me." Holmes, reclining into his favorite armchair, steepled his fingers and fixed the man with an intensity that made me, for once, feel like an intruder. "Pray do not make the mistake of prolonging your suspense," Holmes said, his tone light yet commanding. "Speak plainly, sir. What has brought you from the familiar safety of your home to this modest flat in Baker Street?" The man swallowed audibly, his knuckles whitening around the letter. It is my father, Mr. Holmes. He has been found dead under most peculiar circumstances. The police, They say it is an accident, but I cannot accept that. There are things, signs, I cannot explain." I noted, as always, the way Holmes's eyes flickered with keen interest at the word signs. It was as if a dormant instinct had been roused to immediate vigilance. He straightened, his fingers now unclasped, and leaned forward slightly. "Indeed, sir. Pray take a seat. Begin at the beginning, and do not spare us any detail, however trivial you may consider it." The man who introduced himself as Mr. Reginald Carraway obliged, settling into a chair with the careful gravity of one who fears he may be overheard by some lurking menace. "My father," he began, "was a man of letters, a scholar, a collector of rare manuscripts. His life was quiet, measured, devoted to his work. Last night, he retired to his study as usual. In the morning he was found sprawled upon the floor, his inkwell shattered beside him, and the ink had formed words." Holmes's expression, which had been one of polite interest, sharpened into something bordering on predatory curiosity. "Words, you say?" he prompted, his voice a low, deliberate murmur. "Spoken or written?" "Written," Carraway replied, his hands trembling anew. "But not in the usual manner. The ink, it was as though it had moved of its own accord. Across the blotting paper, it spelled out a message. My father, he was dead, yet the message, it was there. For all I know, it was written in blood." I felt a chill run down my spine, for even in the midst of our many unusual cases, the notion of a message written seemingly by supernatural means was enough to unsettle one's rational faculties. Holmes, however, remained composed, his piercing gaze fixed on Carraway with an intensity that suggested he was already reconstructing every minute detail in his mind. "Fascinating," Holmes said at length, his voice almost a whisper. "And the message, do you recall its contents?" Carraway nodded, fumbling in his pocket for a small scrap of paper. He handed it to Holmes with a tremor that betrayed the fragility of his composure. Holmes took it delicately, unfolding it and reading the scrawled words aloud in a tone that was, curiously, devoid of the usual theatricality. "The ink bears witness to truth that men would bury." Holmes's eyes glimmered with a mixture of intrigue and contemplation. "Indeed, a most enigmatic communication." "Accidental, you say the authorities presume, in your own impression?" "I will not believe it to be mere chance," Carraway said, his voice trembling with conviction. "There is something deliberate in it. Something—" Holmes tapped the paper lightly with his forefinger, eyes narrowing in thought. "And you say the inkwell was shattered?" "Yes," Carraway replied, shuddering. As though in struggle, though there were no signs of forced entry, or of anyone else present in the study. Nothing disturbed, save the inkwell and the paper. Holmes's gaze drifted toward the window, where the fog pressed thickly against the panes, obscuring the lamplight of the street beyond. A singular case, Watson, he murmured. Observe the mental state of the young man, the meticulous nature of the scene, and the peculiar artistry of the written words. There is method here, as there always is, but it eludes the grasp of ordinary observation. Scotland Yard, with their admirable persistence, will see only what is obvious. We shall see what is concealed. I could not help but marvel at the ease with which Holmes seemed to dissect the situation, peeling back layers of mystery as though they were mere garments, and revealing possibilities where others saw only despair. Even as I noted his brilliance, I could sense, too, the weight of unease in the room. Carraway's fear was genuine, and the circumstances he described were, to my mind, sufficiently extraordinary to warrant the attention of my old companion. Holmes looked once more at the paper, then placed it carefully upon the mantelpiece. "We shall visit your father's study, Mr. Carraway," he said, rising with the sudden fluid energy that always preceded his most intense work. "There are elements in the narrative that must be observed firsthand. The air of a room, the position of objects, the minutest traces upon surfaces, these will tell us more than any witness. Watson, you shall accompany us." I hurried to gather my coat and hat, eager as ever to set foot in a scene where Holmes's incomparable powers of deduction might reveal truths hidden from the eyes of ordinary men. As we stepped into the misty streets of London, the gas lamps casting their flickering glow upon the slick cobblestones, I could not help but feel that this case would test even Holmes's prodigious abilities. A scholar dead under mysterious circumstances, a message in ink that might or might not have been written in blood, and a city full of fog and shadows through which danger might lurk unseen. I knew then, with a quiet thrill mingled with apprehension, that we had embarked upon a case unlike any other, one in which the line between the rational and the uncanny would be tested, and where every detail, however trivial, might serve as the key to unlocking a mystery of the deepest and most insidious sort. And so, with the streets shrouded in fog and the clatter of distant wheels echoing through the morning air, we made our way to the Carraway residence, unaware that the ink which had written its chilling message was only the beginning of a narrative more twisted and intricate than any London fog could conceal. We arrived at the Carraway residence in the late morning, the fog having lifted only partially, leaving London in a peculiar half-light that lent every street and alley an uncanny liminal quality. The house itself was an elegant Georgian structure, red-bricked and dignified, with Rortian railings enclosing a narrow courtyard. It bore the marks of careful maintenance, yet there lingered about it the faint odour of age and the weight of family history, the sort of lingering presence that seems to exhale from walls themselves. Mr. Carraway ushered us through the front hall, his hand pressed nervously to the banister, as though to steady both himself and his apprehensions. "This way," he murmured, leading us up a narrow staircase to the second floor. "The study is at the far end of the corridor. My father, he spent almost all his waking hours in that room." Holmes followed silently, his gaze sweeping over every detail with a precision that seemed almost unnatural. I, by contrast, walked a step behind, noting for myself the small but telling signs that Holmes often observed with such penetrating acuity. The faint smudge of a boot on the otherwise immaculate stair carpet, a tiny fleck of ink on the railing's edge, the slight irregularity in the alignment of the portraits that lined the corridor. Each seemed trivial until Holmes's presence lent it significance. The study door stood ajar, and Holmes pushed it open with his customary quiet authority. The room was of modest size, yet suffused with the air of intellectual labour. Walls lined with bookshelves heavy with leather-bound tomes, a large mahogany desk cluttered with papers, inkpots, and a scattering of writing implements. The morning sunlight, weak and grey, fell upon the polished surfaces, illuminating a scene that was at once ordinary, and yet, as Holmes seemed to detect immediately, deeply irregular. At the centre of the floor lay the body of Mr. Carraway's father, still in the position in which he had been found. Despite the tragedy, Holmes's eye did not waver. He approached the body with the same clinical precision with which one examines a chemical reaction or a mathematical proof. "Motus, Watson," he murmured, crouching beside the corpse, the posture, the arms slightly extended, the fingers relaxed, The head turned toward the light source. There is no sign of struggle, yet there is disruption here. He gestured toward the shattered inkwell, the paper upon which the cryptic words had been inscribed, and the faint smears of ink across the blotting pad, and these elements demand a careful consideration of both motive and method. I stepped closer, trying to reconcile the horror of the scene with the calm efficiency of Holmes's movements. The words on the paper still held a strange power, as though the ink itself had left an indelible impression upon my nerves. The phrase, "The ink bears witness to truth that men would bury," seemed to mock the very idea of natural explanation. Holmes, however, made no outward gesture of astonishment. He was already cataloguing the details in that quiet, meticulous fashion that I had come to recognize as the opening salvo in his intellectual warfare with a puzzle. He stood suddenly, moving toward the bookshelves with deliberate steps. "Observe, Watson," he said, plucking a volume at random, "the placement of these tomes. Not haphazard, but arranged according to some system, perhaps by author, perhaps by theme. A man of letters is precise, yet even in his precision there may exist anomalies that betray the intrusion of another hand." Holmes's gaze then fell upon the inkwell, and he crouched again to examine it closely. "Curious," he murmured. "Notice the angle at which it has fallen. It could not have been overturned by the mere slump of the body. There is a force applied, a precise, directed force, not the casual knock of accident." And yet he paused. Tapping a finger on the blotting pad, the ink forms a message that is remarkably legible. This implies deliberate manipulation after the body fell, or an extraordinary hand at work. I could not restrain my own unease. "You suggest, Holmes, that someone else may have been present?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with that strange intensity he reserved for the moments when a puzzle teetered on the brink of revelation. "Not merely present, Watson. We must consider that the author of this message, whether living or otherwise, possessed knowledge of the victim's habits, of the precise positioning of the inkwell, of the manner in which ink behaves upon paper under stress. The words were no mere accident. They are the signature of intent." We moved next to the windows, and Holmes peered outward at the fog-bound streets below. The study itself is enclosed, yet there are always ways in which subtle disturbances manifest: air currents, temperature shifts, the faintest trace of a chemical or organic substance. There is no ordinary explanation for this scene, Watson, though the ordinary mind is tempted to accept the narrative offered by appearances. Our task is to look beyond appearances. Holmes then turned to the desk, running a gloved finger across its polished surface. He paused over a small envelope, dusted with the fine residue of ink. "What is this, Mr. Carraway?" Carraway shook his head. "I do not know. It was upon my father's desk when I entered." Holmes opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, densely inscribed with notes in your father's hand. Most of it appeared scholarly, yet there were certain lines, almost imperceptible, that had been overwritten, obscured, as though someone had sought to hide them in plain sight. Holmes held the paper to the light, tilting it back and forth, examining the shadows cast by the indentation of the pen. "See here," he said finally, pointing to a faint impression. "The pressure of the pen is heavier in places than in others. There are letters which have been written over, almost as though the writer wished to encode a message within the message. We must consider that these words inscribed in the ordinary ink may contain a key to understanding the extraordinary words upon the blotting pad." I felt a shiver as the implications of his observations settled upon me. This was no ordinary death, no simple accident. The mind that orchestrated these events was calculating, methodical, and utterly without regard for ordinary measures of morality. Holmes, for all his detachment, seemed to acknowledge the dark genius required to produce such a tableau. As we continued our survey, Holmes's attention was drawn to a small fragment of paper beneath the desk, almost invisible against the rug. He bent and retrieved it, holding it delicately between thumb and forefinger. "Ah," he whispered, "our first tangible clue. Note, Watson, the trace of ink upon this fragment. It matches neither the inkwell nor the blotting pad. Someone has attempted a supplementary communication, now discarded. This, I suspect, will lead us to a deeper understanding of the author's intent." Mr. Carraway watched us with growing fascination and fear. "Do you truly believe, Mr. Holmes, that my father's death was orchestrated?" Holmes's gaze, steady and implacable, returned to the scene with the calm of absolute certainty. "I do, my dear Carraway. and not only orchestrated, but with a precision that suggests a mind capable of foreseeing the arrival of those who would attempt to decipher the scene. Scotland Yard may see only chaos, we shall see a plan. I felt the familiar mixture of admiration and unease that accompanies any engagement with Holmes's methods. The room, with its subtle disturbances, its scattered yet intentional clues, and the faint, haunting message in ink, was transformed before my eyes. Where others saw a tragic death, Holmes discerned a complex puzzle, the pieces of which must be arranged with patience, insight, and an unerring eye for detail. As we departed the study to confer with Mr. Carraway in the adjoining drawing-room, I could not help but feel that we had only glimpsed the surface of a mystery that would test every faculty I possessed. The fog of London pressed against the windows, as if to mirror the obscurity into which we had stepped, and I knew, with a chill that I could neither deny nor escape, that the ink which had written its cryptic message was only the beginning. In Holmes's mind, I sensed, the shadows were already forming a map, a labyrinth of deduction that would take us through the most peculiar corridors of human intellect and folly. And I, faithful chronicler, could only follow, recording as best I could, the workings of a mind that seemed at once both merciless and merciful in its pursuit of truth. The morning after our visit to the Carraway study brought with it a peculiar chill, as though London itself were aware that a malady of intellect had descended upon its streets. Holmes and I arrived early at Scotland Yard, following a summons from Inspector Lestrade, whose expressions of professional composure were always punctuated by barely concealed agitation whenever he confronted matters that exceeded the usual grasp of police procedure. "Holmes," Lestrade greeted, his hand outstretched, "we have encountered a most perplexing circumstance. There is, as you might expect, a natural explanation, but the difficulty lies in reconciling it with the evidence." Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgement, his gaze never leaving Lestrade's face. "I assure you, Inspector, that reconciliation with evidence is my preferred method of inquiry. Pray, let us hear what has been uncovered." Lestrade led us to a small ante-room where the usual chaos of police work was on display. A corkboard peppered with photographs and hastily scrawled notes, ink-stained gloves and papers scattered upon a table, and a faint, lingering odor of chemicals used in forensics. Upon the wall hung a portrait of Mr. Carraway's father, his calm, scholarly face an ironic contrast to the violence that had befallen him. "The body was found as you saw," Lestrade began, "and the scene examined. There is no sign of forced entry, no evidence of struggle beyond the overturned inkwell and blotting pad. Yet witnesses report a strange message, written in ink that may indeed have been blood. It is," he paused, "a peculiar circumstance." Holmes merely raised a single brow, the subtlety of the gesture conveying a world of understanding that Lestrade could not quite comprehend. "Yes, quite peculiar," he echoed. "And the first suspect?" Lestrade hesitated. "There is a Mr. Theodore Vane, a young scholar who had frequent disputes with the deceased over the acquisition of certain manuscripts. He was known to be envious of Mr. Carraway Sr.'s collection. Witnesses place him near the residence the evening prior, though he claims to have been in his own lodgings. Circumstantial, of course, but—" Holmes leaned forward slightly, his sharp eyes glinting with an almost feral anticipation. "Circumstantial evidence often provides the first breadcrumbs. Yet breadcrumbs, Inspector, may also lead one to a trap of one's own making. What exactly binds Mr. Vane to the scene, aside from opportunity and envy?" Lestrade shuffled papers nervously. "Nothing concrete. But there is testimony that he sought to purchase a particular manuscript, the Codex Erythraeus, which the deceased refused to part with. Arguments were overheard. The young man's agitation was noted. A motive, sir, though indirect." Holmes, his fingers steepled, regarded me silently for a moment. Opportunity, motive, and circumstantial observation. The triumvirate that police often mistake for proof. He tapped a finger lightly on the table. "Watson, do you detect the subtle flaw in their reasoning?" I hesitated, careful in my response. "Is it that there is no direct evidence linking him to the act itself? The presence of a motive does not prove execution." "Precisely," Holmes said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "And yet the police have seized upon Mr. Vane as though the mystery were already resolved. This, my dear Watson, is why our own investigation must be guided by the minutiae overlooked by ordinary scrutiny." At that moment a young officer entered the room carrying a small parcel. "Inspector, this arrived this morning." It was found upon the doorstep of Mr. Carraway's home. No identifying marks beyond this seal. He handed it to Lestrade, who passed it to Holmes without a word. Holmes broke the wax with careful precision, extracting a folded note written in a hand that was not unfamiliar. He scanned it briefly, his lips curling ever so slightly. "Interesting," he murmured. "The message is addressed to Mr. Carraway and bears a warning of sorts. Let me read it aloud. Watson." He cleared his throat and recited in a measured tone, "Cease your inquiries, or the ink shall speak for itself in ways you cannot imagine." The room fell silent, Lestrade's frown deepening. "A threat, Holmes? Surely this points directly to the perpetrator, or at least to someone familiar with the deceased's collection." Holmes shook his head slowly. "Not necessarily, Inspector. Threats are designed to mislead. The less reliable it becomes. One might go so far as to say that the message itself is a form of misdirection, artfully composed to draw attention away from the true author of the act." I felt a chill as I considered the implications. Whoever had orchestrated this had anticipated human weakness, the tendency to leap from motive to guilt without examining subtler evidence. Holmes, as usual, seemed 3 steps ahead, and the trap he perceived was invisible to everyone but him. Lestrade, though respectful of Holmes, seemed visibly uneasy. "Then you do not think Mr. Vane is our culprit?" he asked. Holmes's eyes, cold and calculating, met Lestrade's. "I think, Inspector, that the young man is exactly the sort whom Scotland Yard would mistake for a criminal. But the absence of direct involvement, the lack of fingerprints, the absence of witnesses to the actual act suggests to me that he is, at most, a convenient red herring. The true orchestrator is far more cunning." Lestrade let out a frustrated sigh, muttering under his breath about mind games and tricksters. Holmes ignored him, turning instead to me with a subtle expression of anticipation. "Watson, we must pay a visit to Mr. Vane. Courtesy demands we offer him the opportunity to explain his presence and grievances. Observation, not interrogation, shall be our guide." By early afternoon we arrived at the modest lodgings of Mr. Theodore Vane, a narrow dwelling tucked behind a row of shops along Fleet Street. The interior was dim, the furniture sparse, yet the arrangement revealed the mind of a meticulous man. Books aligned perfectly upon shelves, papers carefully stacked, and instruments for writing and study arranged with exacting precision. Vane himself was a slight man, with dark, restless eyes and the mannerisms of someone perpetually on edge. When Holmes introduced himself, Vane's first reaction was to stiffen, his hands twitching nervously at his sides. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice hesitant, I know why you have come, but I assure you, I had no hand in my father's or your client's tragic fate." Holmes inclined his head, steepling his fingers once again. "We are here not to accuse, Mr. Vane, but to observe. Permit me to ask a few questions. You were in London yesterday evening?" Vane nodded. "Yes. I attended a lecture at the Royal Society on Paleography, and afterwards I dined at a friend's residence." "I can provide witnesses," curious Holmes murmured. "And yet the witness accounts place you near the Carraway residence around the same time." Vane's face paled. "I passed by perhaps, but only briefly. I did not enter. I had no quarrel yesterday, nor any intent that might lead to harm." Holmes studied him in silence for a moment, then tapped a finger on the desk. "You see, Watson, the flaw in the prosecution's case lies not in the motive, nor the proximity, but in the assumption of opportunity. Mr. Vane's presence, coincidental though it may be, provides the perfect camouflage for a mind far more ingenious than his." I felt the familiar thrill of anticipation, tempered by the unease of realizing how easily the authorities could be misled. A young scholar, a jealous rival, and the ever-looming threat of misinterpretation, the stage was set for a far more subtle and sinister mind to maneuver unseen. Holmes, as always, remained inscrutable, yet I sensed the spark of a strategy forming in that remarkable intellect. As we departed Vane's lodgings, the fog had thickened once more, curling around the gas lamps like spectral fingers. The streets of London seemed to echo with hidden footsteps, each shadow a potential witness, each lamp a sentinel over secrets yet unrevealed. Holmes walked with his usual measured step, hands clasped behind his back, eyes alert to every detail, no matter how seemingly trivial. "Watson," he said finally, his voice quiet yet commanding, "our first suspect has presented himself in precisely the manner expected. Observe how the ordinary mind seizes upon him, satisfied with a simple resolution. But our task is to pursue the extraordinary, to peel away the layers until the mechanism beneath becomes visible. I assure you, the story has only begun, and the ink shall yet reveal its deeper truths. As we turned toward Baker Street, I could not help but feel the familiar mixture of apprehension and admiration. The case had presented itself as straightforward to the casual observer a scholar's death, a jealous rival, but Holmes's perception suggested a complexity far greater, a web woven with the precision of a master artisan. The first act had ended, yet the drama, I knew, was only beginning. The following morning dawned cold and overcast, the kind of grey that seemed to seep through the fog-bound streets of London and settle heavily upon the spirit. Holmes and I had agreed to revisit the Carraway residence, this time under the guise of casual inquiry, though I could sense that Holmes's true intent was far more methodical. He had a way, as I have often observed, of cloaking his investigations in routine propriety, all the while scrutinizing details invisible to the ordinary eye. Upon our arrival, Mr. Carraway met us at the door, his anxious expression slightly tempered by the knowledge that Holmes had not abandoned his case. I do not know what else to provide," he murmured, ushering us into the drawing room. "Everything in the study has been left untouched. I dare not alter a single item, lest it destroy the evidence." Holmes's gaze swept the room, taking in every detail with that peculiar mixture of detachment and intensity which I have come to know as the hallmark of his genius. He gestured toward the study. "Your caution is commendable, Mr. Carraway. We shall examine the scene once more. Recall, Watson, that the first step in the unraveling of any mystery lies in the rediscovery of the overlooked." We entered the study quietly. The morning light filtered weakly through the draped windows, casting long, slanting shadows across the floor. The body of Mr. Carraway Sr. remained as we had found it, the inkwell shattered, the blotting pad smeared, and the cryptic words upon the paper holding the same haunting presence. Holmes moved with the deliberate caution of a predator circling its prey, his eyes scanning the surfaces, the angles, the minutiae of the room. I followed, noting once again the precision with which he catalogued the scene. A faint residue of ink upon the corner of the desk, a minuscule disturbance in the dust upon the bookshelves, and the subtle discoloration of the carpet where an object had been shifted imperceptibly. These details, insignificant to any other observer, seemed to guide Holmes's thoughts with invisible strings. After several minutes, Holmes paused, crouching beside the blotting pad and examining it under an angle of light that caused the ink to shimmer faintly. "Curious," he muttered. "Notice, Watson, the pattern of the smears. At first glance they appear random, the product of accidental contact. Yet there is a subtle rhythm here, a repetition in the pressure and direction that suggests deliberate manipulation. Someone has intended these marks to convey information beyond the visible words." I bent closer, straining to detect the pattern he indicated. Though the words themselves were clear, the arrangement of ink smudges and the subtle ridges upon the paper hinted at a message hidden in plain sight. "A code, perhaps?" I suggested, unsure of my inference. Holmes's lips twitched in a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Perhaps, Watson. Or perhaps a clue meant only for those attentive enough to observe it. The question is not what it says, but what it conceals." He straightened abruptly and moved to the desk's corner, lifting a stack of papers with deliberate care. Beneath them lay a narrow envelope, worn and slightly creased. Holmes examined the seal, then tore it open with meticulous precision. Inside was a single sheet of paper, bearing a message in the scholar's own hand. At first it appeared to be nothing more than routine notes marginalia regarding a rare manuscript. Yet Holmes's eyes, sharp and unyielding, detected the subtle anomalies. The indentation of letters beneath the visible script, the faint scoring of the pen in places that seemed otherwise ordinary. "Watson," he said in a low voice, "observe these inconsistencies. Here the pressure is heavier. Here the spacing irregular. It is as though the author, in his final moments, sought to convey a message beneath the apparent text. The key lies not in what was written overtly, but in the unseen and invisible thread connecting his death to a narrative yet unread." I could feel the tension building as Holmes worked, his hands gentle but purposeful as he turned the sheet this way and that, observing the subtle nuances of ink flow and pressure. "And you think this hidden message might reveal the murderer?" I asked, my voice hushed in awe. Holmes's gaze met mine with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. Not merely the murderer, Watson, but the mind behind the act, the intellect capable of orchestrating both the scene and the misdirection. Observe, for instance, the letters here. He pointed to a series of raised impressions along the left margin. They form a pattern, a sequence that corresponds not to language, but to positioning. The victim's hand, I suspect, traced a path before death, leaving an imprint that only the perceptive would decode. I leaned in closer, my own heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fascination. Indeed, the impressions, faint though they were, seemed to hint at a design, a deliberate movement that could easily be mistaken for accident. Holmes, of course, would never mistake it. He was already several steps ahead, his mind constructing a lattice of logic upon which the entire case might eventually rest. Holmes stood suddenly, his eyes sweeping the room with the precision of a hawk. Watson, there is something else. Observe the small fragment of paper we overlooked yesterday, retrieved beneath the desk. The ink upon it matches neither the inkwell nor the blotting pad. This suggests a secondary hand, one that sought to supplement the primary message, to clarify or perhaps to mislead. Mr. Carroway watched silently from the doorway, his anxiety palpable. "Do you think someone returned after my father's death?" he asked, his voice trembling. Holmes did not reply immediately. Instead, he moved to the window, peering outward at the fog-shrouded street. "We must consider all possibilities, Mr. Carroway. There is method in the apparent chaos. One who possesses knowledge of your father's habits, of the study itself, and of his scholarly practices, could easily maneuver without leaving a trace visible to ordinary eyes. We are dealing not with a simple crime, but with an orchestrated puzzle." I felt a shiver as I considered the implications. Whoever had engineered this scene had anticipated human observation, manipulating the evidence to confuse and confound. And yet, Holmes's mind, as always, seemed to penetrate the veil, uncovering the truth hidden within the minutiae. Holmes returned to the blotting pad, running a gloved finger across the paper with careful attention. Watson noticed the angle of these strokes. They are inconsistent with casual contact. They indicate a deliberate hand, one that may have acted under duress or constraint, yet with knowledge sufficient to manipulate the medium. The victim, I suspect, attempted to leave a clue, one that the unobservant would miss entirely. I could scarcely follow the subtlety of his deductions, yet I felt the thrill of witnessing genius at work. Holmes moved with a quiet intensity, cataloguing each minutiae, each irregularity, as though constructing a map of invisible connections. At length he straightened and faced me, eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Watson, we have discovered the hidden clue. It is subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it connects the crime to a mind capable of foresight and misdirection. We must now pursue this thread, observe its implications, and uncover the pattern that links the victim, the inkwell, and the message. The next step, I believe, will lead us closer to the individual orchestrating this elaborate deception." I nodded, feeling the familiar mix of apprehension and admiration that accompanies every engagement with Holmes's intellect. The fog outside had thickened once more, pressing against the windows like an external manifestation of the obscurity we sought to dispel. And I knew with certainty that the discovery of this hidden clue marked a turning point in a case that promised to challenge every faculty of reason we possessed. As we departed the Carroway residence, Holmes walked with a contemplative silence, his mind clearly occupied with the ramifications of our discoveries. I, faithful chronicler, could only follow, recording as best I might the workings of a mind that penetrates darkness, uncovers truth, and remains forever several steps ahead of all others. The shadows of London seemed to deepen around us, echoing the unseen intricacies of a plot that had only begun to reveal its depth. And in that shadowed city, I felt as never before the thrilling certainty that we were on the cusp of uncovering a mystery unlike any we had yet encountered. The days following our discovery of the hidden clue were marked by a peculiar sense of unease that seemed to hang over London as persistently as the ever-present fog. Holmes and I returned frequently to Baker Street after visits to the Carroway residence, each time retracing our observations, comparing the minutiae of the evidence, and discussing possibilities that seemed increasingly intricate. Yet, as often happens in cases of extraordinary subtlety, the ordinary world intruded with its own insistence, reminding us that danger and misdirection often travel hand in hand. It was during one of these visits, in the grey mid-morning, that the news arrived which heightened our concern. A servant from the Carroway household, visibly shaken and unable to speak coherently at first, had rushed to Baker Street with a message. She was accompanied by 2 constables who, despite their best efforts, were already flustered by what they had witnessed. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you must come quickly," she cried, wringing her hands in terror. "There's been another incident. In the same street near the Carraway residence." Holmes, already on his feet, moved with that rapid efficiency that I had come to recognize as the prelude to an acute investigation. "Lead the way," he said, his voice low and taut with anticipation. "Time is critical, Watson. Observe everything. For the ordinary eye will see nothing but the surface of events." We followed the small entourage through the fog-choked streets to a narrow thoroughfare where the gas lamps flickered dimly, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe upon the cobblestones. There, in the dim light, stood a scene that arrested my breath. The front window of a neighboring residence had been smashed, shards of glass glinting like scattered diamonds upon the damp pavement. The interior, visible through the broken pane, bore the unmistakable signs of a hurried intrusion. Drawers were ajar, papers strewn about, and the faint scent of ink strangely reminiscent of the Carraway study hung in the air. Holmes crouched immediately beside the threshold, scanning the scene with meticulous care. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, "the trajectory of the shards. Note their placement. The intruder, whoever they may be, was careful to enter from this side, yet the chaos within has been deliberately created. There is method in apparent disorder, a signature we have seen before." I felt a chill as I stepped closer. The scene seemed to echo the earlier incident at the Carraway study, yet it carried a new and more urgent menace. On the floor, amid scattered papers, lay a small scrap bearing words written in the same peculiar ink that had so disturbed Mr. Carraway. Holmes picked it up with gloved fingers, holding it to the light. The witness observes, yet comprehension eludes him. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "A message, Watson, delivered with the same deliberate hand. Our perpetrator is no longer content with mere misdirection. He or she seeks to unsettle those who would pursue the truth. Note the similarity to the prior inscription. It is a signature, but one designed to mislead those who lack the necessary perception." The constables exchanged uneasy glances, muttering among themselves about a string of burglaries and an escalating menace. Yet Holmes was beyond their comprehension. He moved about the room, examining the papers strewn across the furniture. Each had been disturbed in a manner that suggested knowledge of the contents and, more importantly, of the hierarchy of value within the documents. "Notice, Watson," he said, lifting a folder from the desk and inspecting its contents. "The intruder has selected only certain papers. They are connected to scholarly works, particularly those dealing with rare manuscripts and historical codices. It is not mere theft. It is targeted. Observe the absence of fingerprints. The hand that orchestrates this is precise, careful, deliberate. Our perpetrator is accepted." I could scarcely contain my apprehension. Here was a second incident, far closer to Mr. Carraway's residence, yet linked by a subtle signature that only Holmes could detect. The implications were clear. The mind behind these events was escalating, moving beyond a single isolated act into a broader, more daring pattern. Holmes stood, his expression contemplative. "Watson, we must consider the psychological dimension. The first act left a clue, now revealed and partially observed. The second act demonstrates both confidence and audacity. The perpetrator is aware of our scrutiny, yet tests the limits of our perception. This is no ordinary criminal. We are dealing with a mind that delights in intellectual provocation, one that expects its actions to be analyzed and, to some extent, anticipated." I felt a mixture of admiration and unease. To think that a criminal could treat murder and intrusion as a game of intellect, designing each act to both conceal and reveal, was simultaneously fascinating and horrifying. Holmes, however, seemed invigorated by the challenge, his movements precise, deliberate, and almost serene amidst the tension. Holmes's attention then shifted to a small, nearly imperceptible scuff mark upon the floor near the window. "Observe, Watson," he said, pointing, "the angle of entry, and the subtle abrasion upon the parquet. This indicates the use of a specialized implement, most likely a thin, metallic tool used to lift the window without shattering the glass entirely. Yet the intruder has been forced, by haste or circumstance, to break the outer pane. This is a rare oversight, and one we may exploit in our understanding of their methods." I nodded, following his observations closely, attempting to catalogue for myself the subtleties that marked Holmes's approach. Each detail was a thread, and Holmes's mind, as always, wove these threads into a tapestry of deduction that was invisible to the ordinary observer. Holmes then turned to the scrap of paper upon the floor. "This," he said, "is more than mere taunting. It is a challenge. The perpetrator wishes to demonstrate control, to signal that the game is ongoing and that the investigator is, in a sense, invited to participate under constrained conditions. Observe how the writing mimics the previous message, yet contains a subtle difference, a clue embedded to test our perception." The constables, unable to comprehend the subtleties, murmured about copycats and escalation of crime, but Holmes dismissed them with a wave of his hand. "No, this is the same mind at work. The consistency of the method, the precision of the markings, the choice of targets, these are the hallmarks of a single orchestrator, not a mere coincidence of actors." I felt the tension of the case rise palpably. The second incident had transformed the mystery from a single bizarre death into a series of carefully calculated provocations. The criminal was escalating, moving from subtlety to audacity, and yet each act remained connected by invisible threads that only Holmes could discern. As we departed the scene, Holmes walked with his customary measured step, his mind clearly occupied with the ramifications of the latest development. "Watson," he said quietly, "we are witnessing the emergence of a pattern, and it is one designed to elude conventional understanding. We must prepare for further escalation. Observe the ordinary, anticipate the extraordinary. And remember, in such cases, the mind behind the act is always several moves ahead." The fog had thickened once more, curling around the gas lamps like spectral fingers. The streets of London, with their shadows and flickering light, seemed alive with unseen possibilities. And I knew, with that quiet certainty that accompanies encounters with Holmes's genius, that the rising tension we now felt was merely the precursor to a confrontation that would test every faculty of deduction we possessed. We returned to Baker Street in silence, each of us occupied with the implications of the morning's events. Holmes's mind, as ever, seemed several steps ahead, plotting the interplay of cause and effect, while I, faithful chronicler, attempted to follow and record, knowing that the unfolding drama would require both patience and precision. The game had escalated. The stakes were higher, and the ink, in its cryptic messages and subtle imprints, was writing not merely upon paper, but upon the very fabric of our investigation. The events of the morning left a lingering weight upon my mind, a subtle unease that was only magnified by Holmes's characteristic calm. He moved through the fog-laden streets of London, as though the mist itself were merely a veil behind which the next clue might reveal itself. Our journey to the next scene of inquiry was quiet. Holmes's mind, I knew, was occupied with the intricate lattice of deduction that connected the Caraway incident with the more recent break-in. We arrived at a small establishment in the Soho district, a narrow bookshop owned by a Mr. Harrington, who was reputed to be a collector of rare manuscripts and a man of fastidious taste. It seemed that, during the interval since our last visit, the proprietors of this establishment had suffered a peculiar disturbance, a break-in executed with no apparent motive, leaving only a few pages of rare texts missing and a note left behind, much in the manner we had observed at the Caraway household. Holmes paused at the threshold, surveying the shop with an intensity that made even the proprietor, a stout, nervous man, shift uneasily. "Observe, Watson," he said, "the placement of objects, the orientation of the shelves, and the manner in which the papers have been disturbed. There is a rhythm here, a sequence in the disarray, and a deliberate selection in the items taken. Note that only certain volumes are absent, all bearing the marks of antiquity and rarity. This is no common thief. This is the hand of one who understands value and symbolism." The proprietor, Mr. Harrington, wrung his hands nervously. "I cannot understand it, Mr. Holmes. Nothing else was touched. My registers, my accounts, my ledgers all left intact. Only these rare manuscripts, and this note," he said, extending a small scrap of parchment. Holmes took it with a gloved hand, holding it to the light. The words were brief, written in the same peculiar, deliberate hand that had marked both Caraway's study and the previous break-in. "Truth lies hidden, yet is seen by the observant. Do not presume to comprehend what you cannot grasp." Holmes's eyes narrowed as he read. "Precisely as I anticipated," he murmured. "Observe, Watson, the deliberate mimicry. Our adversary is sending signals, yet with subtle differences intended to confuse and misdirect. The message, while consistent in style, is not identical. It is a variant designed to distract the mind of the investigator, while the true meaning remains concealed beneath layers of deception. I could not help but shiver. The sophistication of the act, the premeditation, and the subtle psychological manipulation suggested a criminal mind far beyond ordinary comprehension. Even as the police might declare themselves satisfied with a convenient suspect, Holmes's insight warned that the apparent simplicity was a trap. "Mr. Harrington," Holmes said, "when did you last notice these volumes?" "Yesterday evening, sir," the proprietor replied, his voice tight. I locked the shop and inspected each shelf. Everything was in order. This morning when I arrived, the volumes were missing, and the note was left upon the counter. Holmes's gaze swept the shop once more. No footprints of ordinary size, no marks indicating forced entry beyond the window. "This intruder is precise, Watson. Yet there is a subtle imperfection here." He gestured toward the floor near the window, a trace left by haste or distraction. "It is our first tangible point of leverage. Observe the scratch upon the sill. The implement used is thin, metallic, perhaps similar to that we observed in the previous intrusion." I nodded, mentally cataloguing the details. Each event mirrored the previous incidents, yet none of the evidence pointed clearly to a culprit. The elegance of the method was as troubling as it was brilliant. Holmes crouched and examined the note again, tilting it in the light. "See here, Watson, the slight variation in letter formation. The S in this note is elongated, while in the Caraway message it was more compressed. Such differences are intended to suggest a separate hand, to mislead anyone attempting to draw a connection. Our adversary is clever, yet, as always, even cleverness leaves traces for the observant mind. We left the shop with Mr. Harrington's gratitude, but the sense of disquiet only grew as we returned to Baker Street. Holmes paced in the sitting room, his steps measured, his hands clasped behind him, eyes flicking to the notes and fragments we had collected over the past days. "It is clear, Watson," he said at length, "that we are being drawn toward a false conclusion. The evidence, while real, is orchestrated to guide the observer's judgment along a predetermined path. The apparent criminal, the young Mr. Vane, perhaps a misguided thief, perhaps merely unlucky in circumstances, a decoy. All the more reason for Scotland Yard to proclaim success prematurely, for they are less equipped than we to discern the hidden logic behind these acts. I ventured cautiously, you believe, Holmes, that someone is deliberately manipulating the investigation itself, that the misdirection is aimed at us as well as the police." Holmes nodded slowly. "Precisely. A mind capable of such precise manipulation of both evidence and observer is one we must approach with the utmost caution. Note how the variations in the notes, the selective thefts, and the careful disruption of scenes all point not to randomness, but to a mind relishing the intellectual engagement of its pursuers. This is a criminal who understands the psychology of deduction, and who anticipates misinterpretation." I shivered at the implications. Whoever this individual might be, they were not merely committing crimes, they were playing a game, a cruel and calculated contest with any who dared to observe. And in this game, mistakes or misjudgments could be fatal. Holmes moved to the window, peering out into the fog-shrouded street. "The next incident, Watson, will escalate further. Observe the ordinary, anticipate the extraordinary, and understand that our adversary seeks not merely to commit theft or murder, but to manipulate perception itself. Scotland Yard is ill-prepared for such subtlety. We, by contrast, must rely upon deduction, observation, and patience." I could feel the tension building, thick and almost tangible, as though the very air around Baker Street were charged with unseen forces. The misdirection was complete. The public perceived a series of unrelated crimes. The police seized upon convenient suspects, yet Holmes, as ever, perceived the invisible architecture that bound each incident to the next. As we sat in the quiet of our sitting room, Holmes methodically cataloguing the variations between each note, I realized with a mixture of admiration and apprehension that we were entangled in a web far more sophisticated than any we had yet encountered. The hand behind these acts was deliberate, the mind brilliant, and the danger immediate. And I knew with a sense of inevitability that I could neither resist nor deny that the game was far from over. The misdirection had deepened, the threads had become more tangled, and the next move by our adversary or by Holmes himself would carry consequences that none of us could yet foresee. The ink, I thought grimly, had begun to write its own story, and each stroke threatened to pull us deeper into the labyrinth from which only the keenest mind might ever emerge unscathed. The day following the disturbing events at Mr. Harrington's shop dawned grey and bitter, the sort of London morning that seems to blur the boundaries between the tangible and the imagined. Holmes was unusually silent during breakfast, his eyes distant, his fingers tapping lightly upon the rim of his teacup. I, ever observant of the slightest shifts in his demeanour, understood that his mind was already immersed in the intricate web of the case, weaving threads invisible to ordinary comprehension. "Watson," he said at last, breaking the silence with a voice both calm and commanding, "it is time to move beyond mere observation. We have accumulated sufficient data to suggest not only the methodology of our adversary, but also a predictable pattern in their actions. The moment has arrived to construct a trap, a carefully calculated contrivance designed to provoke the next incident, while guiding the perpetrator into our field of observation." I leaned forward, both intrigued and apprehensive. "A trap, Holmes? You mean, you intend to lure this criminal into acting again?" Holmes's gaze, keen and unyielding, met mine. "Precisely, Watson. The mind we pursue is subtle, meticulous, and delightfully perverse. It will act not merely to achieve a practical end, but to test its own cleverness against the intelligence of any who attempt to intercept it. If we can predict its movements, anticipate its methods, and manipulate the environment, we may observe the criminal in action and thereby unravel the entire mechanism of deception." He rose and began pacing, hands clasped behind him, eyes alight with the quiet fire of genius. "The pattern is clear. Each act has occurred at locations of scholarly interest, with notes that deliberately mislead, and with a methodical selection of targets. The misdirection is designed to suggest multiple actors, while the underlying truth remains singular. Our task is to create an environment in which the next act may unfold under controlled observation, and in doing so, reveal the signature of the mind behind it." I felt a shiver run down my spine. The audacity of such a plan was breathtaking, yet I trusted Holmes's judgment implicitly. "And how do you propose to accomplish this?" I asked cautiously. Holmes smiled faintly, a subtle curl of the lip that suggested both amusement and anticipation. "We shall employ the principle of bait. Select a location with sufficient attraction to our adversary, a repository of knowledge, a site of scholarly importance, and one where we may conceal our observation. Then we allow the criminal to approach, to act, and to reveal methods and motives previously hidden. The trap, Watson, is both psychological and strategic. It relies upon anticipation of their intellect rather than force or confrontation." He paused, then turned to me with an intensity that sent a familiar thrill through my veins. "We shall prepare a manuscript of apparent value, rare, irreplaceable, and carefully selected for its scholarly significance. This manuscript will be placed where it can be observed, yet protected from theft, so that any attempt to remove it will be revealed without risk to others. In this manner, we provoke the criminal's action while maintaining absolute control of the environment." I nodded, impressed yet slightly daunted by the intricacy of his design. "And you truly believe they will take the bait?" I asked. Holmes's eyes glimmered with certainty. "I have calculated, Watson. The psychology is clear. The mind we pursue thrives upon intellectual challenge, upon the thrill of manipulation. The presentation of a tempting, carefully curated stimulus will almost certainly provoke engagement. They cannot resist the allure of a test, a puzzle, or a demonstration of skill. Observe that the previous incidents were themselves provocations, each designed to misdirect and measure the acuity of those observing. We merely extend this principle in a controlled manner." We spent the remainder of the morning preparing for the plan. Holmes arranged the manuscripts in a small, windowless study within Baker Street, ensuring that access could be monitored without arousing suspicion. We installed a series of signals: faint markings in the corridor, subtle disturbances in the furniture, and indicators upon the floor that would reveal the direction and method of approach. Every detail, every nuance, was considered with meticulous care, from the placement of the books to the faint scent of ink and parchment that would act as an attractant. Holmes moved among these preparations with a singular focus, and I, loyal chronicler, assisted as best I could, arranging materials, cataloguing notes, and observing with vigilance the subtle cues that might escape an ordinary observer. By mid-afternoon, our arrangements were complete. Holmes reclined in his familiar armchair, eyes narrowed in contemplation. Now, Watson, we wait. The criminal, having been observed for some days and having left unmistakable signatures in each previous act, will be drawn to this stimulus. Observe patience, discretion, and silence. These are our instruments. The mind we pursue delights in testing others, yet it is even more revealing when it believes itself unobserved. I sat nearby, a mixture of anticipation and unease settling over me. The room was quiet save for the distant rumble of hansom cabs and the faint occasional cough of a passerby in the fog-bound street. Holmes, however, seemed entirely immune to external distraction, his mind focused upon the potential strategies, errors, and patterns of our adversary. Hours passed with only the faintest movement in the study to break the monotony. Holmes, however, was restless, frequently rising to inspect the arrangement of manuscripts, adjust the subtle markers, or examine the alignment of chairs and papers. Each minute, I realized, brought us closer to the inevitable engagement with the mind we sought. Finally, as dusk fell and the gas lamps outside flickered to life, Holmes motioned for silence. Watson, observed closely. The first approach is imminent. Our adversary, having demonstrated both boldness and subtlety, will act under cover of shadow and obscurity. We must remain concealed until the precise moment that our observation will reveal the method, the motive, and the identity. The anticipation was nearly unbearable. Every passing moment seemed charged with possibility, every creak of the building, every whisper of wind through the street, a potential signal of arrival. Holmes, in contrast, was calm, poised, his eyes alight with the quiet satisfaction of a mind in control of a complex and delicate enterprise. And then, as the last rays of sunlight faded and the fog thickened outside, a subtle disturbance caught Holmes's attention, a movement at the far window, the faint glimmer of reflection upon glass, and the softest scrape of metal upon wood. He leaned forward, whispering to me, Watson, the game begins. Observe everything, note every subtlety, and above all, do not interfere. Our adversary reveals all, if one knows how to watch. I felt a thrill mingled with dread as we crouched in silent anticipation. The trap had been set, the bait was placed, and the criminal, confident in their own cleverness, was about to walk directly into the scrutiny of Sherlock Holmes. For the first time in days, the tension that had been building since the Carroway death reached a palpable crescendo, and I realized, with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, that the mind we pursued would now demonstrate in its own way the depths of its ingenuity and, perhaps, its hubris. The night air was thick with fog when the moment we had long anticipated finally arrived. Holmes and I had maintained our vigil in the concealed study of Baker Street, the manuscripts laid out as bait, the subtle markers in place to reveal every movement of our unknown adversary. The hour was late, the street below silent save for the occasional clip-clop of a distant cab, and every shadow seemed poised to harbor some hidden truth. Holmes had been in near-complete stillness for hours, his eyes scanning the faintly illuminated room, hands folded behind his back, his mind apparently engaged in a calculus invisible to me. I, in contrast, was on tenterhooks, every noise amplified, every flicker of movement magnified by the tension of waiting. It was only then, as the clock struck 11, that a soft creak from the far corner of the room caught Holmes's attention. He did not speak immediately, but I observed him shift ever so slightly, eyes narrowing, as though he were reading a signal only he could perceive. "Watson," he whispered, his voice low and measured, "observe carefully. The first step is made. The individual approaches, yet remains cautious, as any mind familiar with observation would be. Notice the hesitation it betrays both knowledge and anxiety. They know instinctively that their actions are being watched, yet the temptation of the bait is irresistible." I followed his gaze to the window, where a shadow moved with feline precision. A figure slipped through the fog, barely audible above the occasional stirrings of the street, and approached the study's entrance. The intruder carried nothing visible, but their posture suggested careful concealment. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Observe, Watson, the hand of a master manipulator. Note how the individual examines the lock before proceeding, adjusting to the subtle irregularities of the mechanism. Our adversary is not merely bold but calculated, fully aware of the potential consequences of detection." The figure reached the study door and, with a soft metallic whisper, manipulated the latch. Holmes's own subtle preparation, the displacement of chairs, and the faintly marked floor revealed the precise angle of approach. Confirming what he had long suspected, this was no ordinary criminal. The intruder entered, moving toward the manuscripts with a combination of reverence and purpose. The carefulness, the deliberate selection of texts, and the attention to markers all confirmed Holmes's assertion. The mind we pursued was engaged in a game of intellect as much as any act of theft or disruption. Holmes stepped forward suddenly, his movements swift but quiet. "Now, Watson," he said, his voice calm yet commanding. "Observe closely, for the moment of revelation is upon us." The intruder froze, apparently startled by an imperceptible shift of shadow within the room. Then, to my astonishment, the figure slowly raised their head. It was Theodore Vane. My mind reeled at the sight. Was it possible that the young scholar, whose motive had seemed only circumstantial, had orchestrated the series of events? Holmes, however, did not seem surprised. "Mr. Vane," Holmes said, his tone precise, measured, and quietly sardonic, "I am obliged to you for your participation in this demonstration. Pray, do not mistake my courtesy for leniency." Vane's eyes flickered with fear, but also with an unmistakable glimmer of comprehension. Holmes raised a single finger, halting him. "Do not speak yet. Observe. Every action, every hesitation, every adjustment you made in entering this room has been catalogued. The variations in your handling of the manuscripts, the subtle differences in your approach to the markers, the slight tremor in your hand when manipulating the lock, they reveal a mind attempting both to conceal and to express itself. You are clever, Mr. Vane, yet there is an error that has betrayed you." Vane's color drained. I merely saw too." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Ah, but you did, in a sense. Your earlier visit to Carraway's study, the comments regarding the manuscripts, your proximity to the scene all suggest knowledge and opportunity. Yet it is not you who is behind the orchestrated misdirection, nor the carefully executed series of disturbances. You have been, quite intentionally, the convenient figure upon whom suspicion was to be placed. Observe, Watson, the genius of misdirection. Vane's own innocence is the perfect veil for the true perpetrator." I felt the tension in my chest tighten. Holmes's deduction, as always, revealed a world far more intricate than my own mind could fully grasp. The series of crimes, the messages, the subtle manipulations, they were not the work of the obvious suspect, but of an unseen hand, one with patience, foresight, and a profound understanding of human psychology. Holmes motioned toward the manuscripts, and then toward a series of clues subtly positioned around the room: the scuff marks, the displacement of chairs, the faint residue of ink. "Observe, Watson, the pattern. The thief, or rather the manipulator, does not act randomly. Each scene has been crafted to mislead, to provoke curiosity, and to draw suspicion away from the true mind at work. Vane, by virtue of his prior presence and motive, becomes the red herring, while the real author of these acts remains concealed until we unravel the logic embedded in each gesture." Vane sank into a chair, relief and fear mingling on his face. So I was a decoy," he whispered. Holmes inclined his head. "Precisely, and that is the brilliance and audacity of the mind we pursue. By placing you in proximity to suspicion, by exploiting your motives and behavior, they divert attention while orchestrating events elsewhere. The messages, the selective thefts, the patterns of entry, they are all designed to guide perception away from the source." I felt the thrill of revelation mingled with apprehension. Holmes, as ever, had not only anticipated events, but had crafted a means of exposing the mind behind them without alerting the criminal to our awareness. "But Holmes," I asked, "who could possess such foresight and subtlety? What mind delights in such elaborate misdirection?" Holmes's gaze sharpened. "We shall soon discover, Watson. The final act, the ultimate reveal, requires patience, observation, and a precise understanding of motive and method. The perpetrator, confident in their skill, will act once more, believing themselves unobserved, and it is in that final act that we shall see the genius and perhaps the folly of their plan laid bare." Vane looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. "I do not know how to thank you, Mr. Holmes. I feared the worst, yet you have seen through the deception." Holmes's lips twitched faintly. "You need not thank me, Mr. Vane. Observe, as I always do, the ordinary mind is easily misled. That is why we must prepare for the conclusion, where all threads misdirection, observation, and psychology will converge, and the true author of this intricate series of acts will be revealed. As we left Baker Street that night, the fog enveloped the city in a thick, almost suffocating embrace. Holmes's mind, I knew, was already several moves ahead, anticipating the next action, the next signature, the final revelation. The stage was set for a confrontation that promised to illuminate the genius, audacity, and perhaps the darkness of the individual who had orchestrated these events with such meticulous care. The city seemed to hold its breath, as though aware that a secret long concealed was on the verge of exposure, and that the ink, which had written messages both literal and cryptic, was preparing to complete its final, chilling narrative. The fog that had lain thick upon London for days seemed to press closer around Baker Street that evening, as though the very city itself awaited the culmination of our prolonged investigation. Holmes had spent the entire day reviewing his notes, scrutinizing each subtle clue, each variation in ink pressure, every disturbance of furniture or manuscript. I observed him with a mixture of admiration and apprehension, acutely aware that the final steps of the case steps he had long anticipated were now at hand. Holmes rose suddenly, glancing toward the door as if the very shadows held counsel. "Watson," he said, "the time has come. We must assemble all parties who have been drawn into this labyrinth of misdirection. Only in the presence of all concerned can we demonstrate the unity of events, the orchestration of clues, and the folly of the criminal's assumption that their design would remain concealed." I nodded, though my pulse quickened. It was to be a meeting that would bring together Mr. Carraway, Mr. Harrington, young Vane, and, crucially, the agents of Scotland Yard. Holmes's plan, as I understood it, relied upon both observation and psychology. The criminal, confident in their own cleverness, would reveal themselves when they believed they were unobserved. By the hour of 8, the gathering was complete in the study of Baker Street, a room meticulously prepared to highlight every prior disturbance and subtle mark of our adversary. The manuscripts, now carefully arranged, seemed almost to glow under the faint lamplight, their presence a lure and a testament to Holmes's foresight. Holmes began calmly, addressing the group with his usual precision. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here not merely to discuss events that have perplexed Scotland Yard, but to witness the culmination of a chain of actions deliberately designed to mislead, provoke, and challenge those who would seek the truth." He turned toward the assembled individuals, eyes sharp and penetrating. "Consider, if you will, the sequence of incidents. The tragic death in the Carraway study, the break-in at Mr. Harrington's shop, and the various messages left at each scene. Each act appeared isolated, yet each bore the unmistakable signature of the same mind, exercising subtle misdirection and psychological manipulation. The question is not merely who acted, but why and how the visible evidence conceals the underlying design." I watched as the attendees leaned forward, some anxious, others curious, while young Vane fidgeted in his chair, his earlier relief now replaced by an unmistakable tension. Holmes gestured to a series of papers and objects carefully positioned around the room. "Observe the traces left behind, the minute imperfections, the variations in handwriting and ink pressure. These were not mistakes. They are deliberate signals intended to convey both presence and misdirection. Our adversary relied upon assumption that the ordinary mind would fail to perceive the subtle architecture of events." At this, I noted a faint movement near the window, a shadow flitting against the fogged glass. Holmes's eyes, ever vigilant, caught it instantly. "Ah, the final participant, it seems, has arrived." From the shadows stepped a figure, tall and deliberate, their gait confident yet measured. It was none other than Dr. Elias Merton, a scholar of rare manuscripts, whose name had surfaced briefly in previous conversations, yet whose involvement had seemed, at first glance, innocuous. Holmes's expression did not change, though his eyes glimmered with the satisfaction of one who has long anticipated such an entrance. "Dr. Merton," Holmes said, voice calm, almost courteous, "I am obliged for your attendance. Pray, do not mistake courtesy for leniency." Merton's eyes flickered with recognition and a fleeting panic. I do not understand. What is this?" he stammered. Holmes gestured to the manuscripts. "Observe, Doctor, the sequence of events and the carefully placed notes. Each act, each minor disturbance, each written message, bears the hallmark of intentional design. Yet it is your hand that orchestrated the pattern, exploiting the presence of others. Mr. Carraway, Mr. Harrington, Mr. Vane to act as red herrings. You misjudged, however, the depth of observation available to those attuned to subtlety. I watched as Merton's composure faltered. Holmes continued, explaining each incident in meticulous detail. The subtle variation in the blotting pad's smears at Carraway's study, the selective theft of manuscripts at Harrington's shop, the slight discrepancies in ink and pressure, all culminating in the placement of our own bait at Baker Street. Each clue was a thread, and Holmes wove them into a tapestry so precise that there was no room left for evasion. You calculated, Holmes said quietly, that suspicion would naturally fall upon Mr. Vane, whose proximity and motive were convenient for your design. Yet in your reliance upon deception, you underestimated the power of observation combined with logical deduction. You failed to anticipate the use of controlled stimuli, bait and markers designed to provoke the final reveal. And here, Dr. Merton, you stand exposed. Merton's face paled. You cannot prove anything. It was only a test of intellect, a demonstration. Holmes's gaze was cold, implacable. A test of intellect, perhaps, but a test that resulted in the death of Mr. Carraway and the terror of others. In your pursuit of subtlety and challenge, you lost sight of morality. The crime is now as visible as the evidence itself. The constables stepped forward, acting on Holmes's unspoken signal. The criminals' confidence, built upon meticulous planning and a belief in their own cleverness, had unraveled in the presence of meticulous observation. Merton was apprehended quietly, his protestations growing increasingly desperate. Yet all proof is meticulous planning. The notes, the alterations in manuscripts lay plainly before us, irrefutable in its clarity. Holmes turned to the assembly, voice now softened, though still carrying the weight of authority. The lesson, as ever, is that the mind which seeks to manipulate must reckon with the mind which observes. Observation, deduction, and patience reveal the truth that misdirection seeks to obscure. Dr. Merton's genius, while formidable, has been surpassed by the simple, unerring application of reason and attentiveness to detail. Young Vane exhaled, relief washing over his features, while Mr. Carraway and Mr. Harrington nodded with a mixture of gratitude and awe. I, too, felt the profound satisfaction of witnessing the intricate machinery of deduction bring clarity to chaos. Holmes, as was his custom, did not gloat. Instead, he moved to the window, peering out at the fog-bound streets of London with a contemplative air. "Watson," he said softly, "the mind that seeks to mislead often leaves behind the smallest imperfection. These are the threads upon which we may hang the tapestry of truth, and though the game is concluded, we must remain vigilant, for intelligence, cunning, and audacity will never be lacking in our city." I sat back, reflecting upon the events of the past days. The fog seemed lighter somehow, the gas lamps casting a steadier glow, yet the memory of Dr. Merton's ingenuity and audacity lingered. I realized with renewed admiration that Holmes's triumph was not merely the apprehension of a criminal, but the illumination of a mind so precise, so calculating, that even in villainy it bordered upon genius. And as the night deepened around Baker Street, I knew that our city, and the shadows that lurked within them, had been rendered a little safer not by chance, not by force, but by the inexorable power of observation, reasoning, and the unerring intellect of Sherlock Holmes. The fog that had so long clung to London seemed, in the days following Dr. Merton's apprehension, to lift gradually from my own mind, though the events of the past fortnight lingered with the persistence of a shadow. The city resumed its ordinary rhythms, hansom cabs rattling across the cobblestones, the occasional clip-clop of boots echoing through narrow streets, and the ever-present hiss of steam from the sewers below. But within Baker Street, a quieter reckoning took place. Holmes and I, having witnessed the conclusion of one of the most intricate investigations of our acquaintance, were left to reflect upon the lessons it had imposed. Dr. Merton, now securely in custody, had been subjected to the relentless inquiries of Scotland Yard, whose agents were at once astonished and humbled by the depth of his planning. He had believed himself untouchable, confident in his skill to manipulate, misdirect, and confound. Yet the very brilliance of his design had become his undoing, for Holmes had anticipated not only the sequence of events but the psychology behind them. I found myself, as always, in awe of Holmes's methods. His triumph lay not merely in the apprehension of a criminal, but in the careful orchestration of circumstances that allowed the truth to reveal itself naturally. The intricate dance of observation, deduction, and psychological insight had produced clarity from confusion, and in that clarity lay a lesson of profound significance. That intelligence, however formidable, is never immune to the scrutiny of a mind equally disciplined. I sat one morning in our Baker Street sitting room, pen in hand, recording the events for posterity. Holmes reclined in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes fixed upon some distant point of contemplation, a faint smile curling at the corners of his lips. The manuscripts which had served as bait still lay on the table, their presence a silent testament to the subtlety of the trap that had ensnared Dr. Merton. "Holmes," I said at length, my voice betraying both curiosity and admiration, "I have often marveled at your ability to predict the actions of others. But this case more than any other reveals a profound psychological acuity. It is as though you were able to enter Merton's mind, to anticipate not merely his actions but his intentions, even before he himself had fully grasped them." Holmes's gaze shifted to me, eyes bright with their characteristic intensity. "Watson, the mind that manipulates does so according to patterns, however subtle. Every action, every choice, every minute alteration in behavior follows a logic, however deeply hidden. Our task is to perceive that logic, to construct the sequence of cause and effect, and to act upon it. In Merton's case, the intelligence was prodigious, but it was not infallible. The smallest imperfection and overlooked trace, a hesitation, a subtle variation in method provided the opening through which the truth could be discerned. I reflected upon the moral dimensions of the affair. Merton had acted under the guise of intellectual curiosity, yet his actions had wrought death and terror. The lesson was inescapable. Genius, untempered by conscience, could inflict harm in ways subtle and devastating. Holmes, in his customary fashion, addressed this point obliquely, as if to temper my reflections. "Watson," he said quietly, "it is one of the peculiarities of human intelligence that the pursuit of intellectual satisfaction may blind even the most capable mind to consequences. The lesson, however, is twofold. Vigilance, which allows the observant mind to detect the misdirection, and moral awareness, which separates the clever from the virtuous. It is in the interplay of these qualities that true mastery of deduction is found." I nodded, though the weight of the recent events pressed upon me. The death of Mr. Carroway, the terror inflicted upon Mr. Harrington, and the manipulation of young Vane were tragedies that could not be undone. Yet there was solace in the certainty that justice, however subtly and indirectly applied, had been achieved. Holmes's skill had ensured that the criminal's ingenuity was met and surpassed by a mind equally formidable, yet guided by reason and conscience rather than ego or whim. The streets of London, as I observed from our window, resumed their ordinary rhythms. Yet I could not shake the impression that beneath the familiar patterns of commerce and domesticity, the city held countless secrets, many as subtle and intricate as those we had just unravelled. Holmes, as ever, was attuned to these hidden dimensions, his intellect scanning the familiar fog for irregularities, patterns and signals invisible to ordinary eyes. In our quiet moments, Holmes reflected upon the broader implications of the case. "Watson," he said, "the most challenging aspect of such investigations is not merely the detection of criminal activity, but the anticipation of the mind behind it. Each individual is a universe of motivations, prejudices, and desires. In cases of deliberate misdirection, one must not only observe actions but interpret the unseen intentions that give rise to them. The mind that acts with foresight will always leave traces, however faint, and it is our task to detect, interpret, and act upon them." I could not help but marvel at the simplicity with which he stated principles that were, in practice, extraordinarily complex. Holmes's ability to reduce chaos to comprehensible patterns, to illuminate intention through the faintest clues, remained, to my mind, almost preternatural. Yet even in triumph, Holmes remained humble. He did not indulge in ostentation or vanity, nor did he boast of his successes. Instead, he returned, as he always did, to the quiet rhythm of our shared life at Baker Street, reading, observing, and occasionally instructing me in subtleties of deduction that I had barely begun to comprehend. The lessons of the Carroway case, of Merton's audacity and downfall, would remain with me, etched in memory with the precision of his logic. I, for my part, chronicled the events faithfully, aware that in years to come, readers might marvel at the audacity of the scheme, the intricacy of the misdirection, and the brilliance of the detection. Yet I also knew that the story's true lesson lay not merely in the mechanics of the crime, but in the enduring power of observation, intellect, and moral vigilance to reveal truth from the fog of deception. As I finally set down my pen, Holmes rose and moved to the window, gazing out upon the lamplit streets. "The game is concluded, Watson," he said softly, "yet we must always be ready. In London, the extraordinary often hides behind the ordinary, and intelligence, however brilliant, will forever encounter its equal or its superior." I remained seated, reflecting upon the case, the moral ambiguities, and the relentless pursuit of truth that defined my companion. The night deepened, the fog swirled, and in the quiet of Baker Street, I realized that while the criminal had been apprehended, the lessons of observation, deduction, and the subtleties of human character would remain with me always. In that quiet contemplation I understood, with a mixture of awe and gratitude, that the city, with all its shadows and secrets, would continue to challenge. And intrigued, but with Sherlock Holmes at our side, even the most intricate deception could eventually be unraveled. The days that followed Dr. Merton's apprehension were unusually quiet for Baker Street. London's fog hung low over the city, a muted curtain upon the familiar streets, yet within our rooms a different sort of contemplation unfolded. Holmes, ever restless in the pursuit of intellectual stimulation, had settled into a contemplative mood, his mind no longer fully occupied with the immediate urgency of criminal pursuit, but rather with the broader reflections that cases such as this invariably prompted. I found him in the sitting room one afternoon, leaning back in his chair, hands steepled, eyes fixed upon some distant point beyond the fogged windows. The manuscripts from the trap remained on the table, carefully preserved, their presence a silent reminder of both the danger and the genius that had shaped the events. "Holmes," I began cautiously, "you seem peculiarly subdued, as if the capture of Merton, brilliant though he was, has left a lingering contemplation in your mind." Holmes's eyes, though distant, twinkled with the faintest hint of amusement. "Watson, one does not merely apprehend a criminal and dismiss the implications of their design. Every intricate act, every variation in method, every subtle attempt at misdirection speaks to the complexity of human intellect and the precariousness of morality. It is in these reflections that I find the deepest satisfaction, for intellect divorced from conscience is a dangerous instrument indeed." I nodded, though I struggled to reconcile the abstract with the immediate. "Yet, Holmes, you handled the case with such precision. The criminal's genius was considerable, yet you anticipated every move, laid every trap, and revealed the truth in a manner that was both complete and inevitable." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Inevitability is the result of observation and deduction, Watson, not fortune. The human mind, no matter how subtle, cannot fully conceal its impulses, its habits, and its tendencies. A criminal who seeks to mislead leaves behind traces, minute yet indelible, which reveal both method and motive. Our task is to perceive them, to reconstruct the chain of logic, and to act upon it. That is the essence of our craft." I was struck as always by the clarity and simplicity of his exposition, though the depth of its implication was profound. Holmes continued, turning his gaze toward the fog streets below, his expression contemplative. "Observe, Watson, that the criminal mind often deceives not merely through action, but through expectation. Merton relied upon the assumption that suspicion would naturally fall upon others, that the ordinary mind would fail to perceive the subtle architecture of events. He misjudged the combination of patience, observation, and logical deduction, and in that misjudgment, his downfall was secured. It is a lesson that applies not only to the criminal but to all who navigate the complexities of life." I reflected upon his words, aware that beneath the calm surface of his speech lay a philosophical current, a meditation upon intelligence, morality, and the consequences of human action. Holmes, for all his detachment and singular focus on deduction, was keenly attuned to the moral dimension of our work of fact I had often noted, but which now seemed to resonate more profoundly. "Holmes," I ventured, "do you ever tire of such pursuits? Of the constant engagement with the darker facets of human nature, the ceaseless unraveling of deception?" Holmes smiled faintly, a rare expression that seemed almost wistful. "Watson, one never tires of truth. The pursuit of it is inexhaustible. And yet, it is not merely the act of detection that sustains the intellect, but the reflection upon its meaning, the understanding of the interplay between human action, motivation, and consequence. In that reflection, one finds both satisfaction and, if one is honest, humility. The humility I observed was genuine. For all his brilliance, Holmes did not indulge in self-congratulation. He regarded his triumphs as the natural outcome of methodical thought and rigorous observation, rather than personal superiority. As the evening approached, and the gas lamps cast a soft glow upon the fog-bound streets, Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the window. He gazed silently at the familiar panorama of London, the city alive with countless lives, secrets, and unrecorded dramas. "Watson," he said finally, his voice quiet yet resolute, "the conclusion of one case is merely the preparation for the next. The city is ever in motion, and within it, deception, folly, and criminal ingenuity flourish in countless forms. We have glimpsed one such manifestation, and its unraveling has been instructive. Yet vigilance must remain constant, observation keen, and intellect ever alert." I felt a sense of awe at his words, as though the entire city itself were a chessboard upon which Holmes had mastered not merely the movements of pieces, but the subtleties of strategy, psychology, and human nature. "And yet," he continued, turning his piercing gaze toward me, "one must also recognize the limits of intervention. Not every act can be prevented, not every tragedy averted. Our task is to apply reason, to observe, to deduce, and when opportunity allows, to act. Beyond that, one must accept the consequences of human choice and circumstance, for the world is neither wholly rational nor entirely just." I sat silently, absorbing his words, aware that in them lay both a comfort and a warning. Holmes's philosophy, tempered by experience and intellect, was both an instruction and a reflection upon the human condition. Finally, he returned to his chair, reclined, and allowed a moment of quiet to settle upon the room. The manuscripts, the traces of the investigation, and the faint residue of Merton's audacious plan remained as silent witnesses to the ordeal and to the triumph of deduction over deception. "Watson," he said at length, "the city sleeps, and with it, countless minds, some benign, others malevolent. We have witnessed one instance of ingenuity and malice, and have countered it through reason and observation. Let us remember always that the smallest imperfection betrays the greatest intellect. That, I believe, is the enduring truth of our profession." I could not help but feel a profound sense of admiration, coupled with a renewed awareness of the precariousness of human endeavor. Holmes, with his unparalleled mind, had once again illuminated a path through chaos, revealing both the brilliance and the folly that dwell within the human heart. As I finally rose to retire for the night, the fog thickened once more upon London, and the gas lamps glimmered softly against the damp streets. I realized with a mixture of awe and quiet gratitude that the lessons of this case, the subtleties of misdirection, the power of observation, and the interplay of intellect and morality would remain with me always. And in the silent contemplation of that fog-bound city, I knew that with Sherlock Holmes as guide, the mysteries of London, however intricate or perilous, would never remain unsolved for long. The streets of London had begun to regain their ordinary rhythm, yet the fog, that eternal companion of the city, clung stubbornly to the alleys and squares as though preserving the memory of the recent disturbances. Within Baker Street, however, a quieter atmosphere had settled, one of reflection rather than tension, of subtle triumph rather than ostentation. Holmes, as ever, had returned to his habitual repose, yet I could see in the faint flicker of his eyes the restless engagement of a mind never truly idle. In the calm of the sitting room, I found myself seated opposite him, pen in hand, recording the final impressions of the case. The manuscripts that had served as the bait for Dr. Merton remained carefully arranged upon the table, their pages a silent testament to the extraordinary precision of our enterprise. The city outside hummed with ordinary activity, yet within these walls, the resolution of extraordinary events lingered in every shadow and surface. Holmes broke the silence, his voice soft yet deliberate. "Watson, there is a peculiar satisfaction in bringing order to chaos, yet the world rarely remains ordered for long. What we have witnessed in this case, the brilliance of Merton, the audacity of his misdirection, and the ultimate triumph of reason, is a reminder that intellect, untempered by morality, is both formidable and fragile." I nodded, reflecting upon the events with a mixture of relief and lingering awe. "Holmes," I said, the manner in which you orchestrated the trap, anticipated Merton's moves, and revealed the truth without alerting him to your awareness is nothing short of miraculous. I am continually struck by the depth of your foresight and the subtlety of your methods." Holmes inclined his head, a faint smile flickering across his lips. "Miracle has little to do with it, Watson. Observation, deduction, and an understanding of human psychology, these are the tools by which the ordinary becomes extraordinary. Every act, every misstep, every trace left behind is a piece of the puzzle. One must only possess the patience to notice and the intellect to interpret." I glanced toward the manuscripts, their presence a lingering reminder of the intellectual duel that had so recently concluded. And yet, I ventured, for all the brilliance and planning, there was a certain danger in relying upon the adversary's curiosity. You risked not only the criminal's unpredictable genius, but also the lives of those who had unwittingly become entangled in the scheme. Holmes's gaze was steady, thoughtful. "Indeed, Watson, risk is the companion of all great undertakings. Yet in this instance, it was mitigated by foresight, by careful arrangement, and by the anticipation of human behavior. One cannot remove uncertainty from human affairs entirely, but one may manipulate circumstances to render the probable outcome clear. It is in that clarity that justice may be exacted and truth revealed." I allowed a moment of silence to settle between us, reflecting upon the broader implications of the case. The death of Mr. Carroway, the terror inflicted upon Mr. Harrington, and the unwitting involvement of young Vane were sobering reminders of the consequences of intellect untethered by conscience. Yet, thanks to Holmes, the intricate plan had unraveled, and the criminal's ingenuity had been met and surpassed by an equal and disciplined mind. Holmes, observing my contemplation, spoke again. "Watson, it is always tempting to dwell upon the moral implications of a case, to lament what might have been avoided. Yet our duty is not to rewrite the past but to understand it, to interpret it, and to act when opportunity permits. The lessons of Merton's misdirection extend beyond mere criminality. They illuminate the patterns of human thought and the vulnerabilities inherent in all designs, however subtle." I reflected further upon his words, realizing that beyond the immediate resolution lay a deeper understanding and meditation upon intellect, morality, and the delicate balance between the two. Holmes's skill lay not only in perceiving the sequence of events, but in recognizing the ethical and psychological threads that wove through human behavior. The gas lamps outside flickered against the fog-laden streets, casting long shadows that danced across the walls of our sitting room. Holmes, ever perceptive, followed my gaze and allowed a faint smile to touch his features. "The city is a labyrinth, Watson, filled with countless mysteries, both great and small. It is in the unseen, the subtle, and the overlooked that the truth often lies. One must cultivate patience, observation, and intellect to perceive it." I felt a profound admiration for the quiet rigor of his philosophy. Holmes, for all his brilliance, did not claim omnipotence or finality. He recognized the limits of intervention while celebrating the power of reason and observation. In that recognition, I perceived not only the essence of his skill but the guiding principle of his life. As I prepared to set aside my pen, Holmes leaned back, hands clasped behind his head, eyes fixed upon some distant point beyond the window. "Watson," he said finally, "another case will inevitably present itself. London is inexhaustible in its capacity for both ordinary events and extraordinary deception. Our task is perpetual: to observe, to interpret, and when necessary, to act. The satisfaction lies not in finality, but in the engagement of the mind and the revelation of truth." I rose, feeling the weight of his words and the enduring significance of the recent case. The city outside, bathed in the muted glow of gas lamps, seemed at once familiar and mysterious, a labyrinth of human endeavor, intelligence, and secrecy. I realized that while the immediate danger had passed, the lessons of the case, the subtlety of misdirection, the power of observation, and the necessity of moral vigilance would remain with me always. Holmes, noting my contemplative silence, inclined his head slightly. "Watson, chronicling these events is as vital as participating in them. In preserving the sequence, the reasoning, and the reflection, you ensure that both triumph and lesson endure. Remember always. Intellect, untempered by conscience, may achieve remarkable feats, but reason guided by ethical observation secures lasting understanding." I smiled faintly. recognizing in his words the quiet wisdom that underpinned all our endeavors. The manuscripts, the traces of Merton's audacious plan, the fog-bound streets of London, and the shadows that played upon them all were now a part of our shared memory, a testament to the subtle power of deduction and the enduring vigilance of Sherlock Holmes. As I finally set aside my pen, the evening deepened around Baker Street, and the city, ever mysterious, ever alive, seemed to whisper its secrets to those capable of perceiving them. And in the quiet of that fog-laden night, I understood, as I always did, that with Sherlock Holmes at my side, no deception could remain unobserved, no puzzle unsolved, and no truth concealed forever. Thus concluded another extraordinary case, one that demonstrated both the heights of intellect and the depths of moral consequence, and reaffirmed, as all such adventures do, the enduring brilliance of Sherlock Holmes.